Have you ever struggled with bias tape? Maybe it ended up looking uneven, wavy, or the stitches were showing where you didn't want them. Today, I'm going to demystify it for you. Check out the timestamps here and below. In this video, we'll demonstrate bias taping on 3 different areas. The garments in demonstration are my sewing patterns that you can find in my Etsy store, link in the description. I have a playlist that covers all common sewing techniques, explained in a very detailed, failure-proof way. Oh, and before we dive in, if you enjoy sewing tutorials, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also find me on the Linen Girl social media handles. Prepare your bias tape. One key thing to understand is that different fabrics have different amounts of stretch. That means a single, rigid formula for bias tape length doesn't always work perfectly. But don't worry, I'm going to show you a reliable method, a technique I learned directly from my professional seamstress. You can buy pre-made bias tape, but for these garments, I highly recommend making your own bias tape from the same fabric as your garment. Why? It ensures a perfect color match and the same drape. To cut your own, find the true bias, start at one corner of your fabric, measure 5 centimeters or 2 inches along each edge from that corner. Mark those 2 points, then draw a straight line to connect them. This forms a triangle. Now, from the original corner, draw a line that goes straight across to meet the diagonal line at a right angle. That's your true bias. The width I use for my bias tape is 2.5 centimeters. You can estimate and cut a generous length. The precise measurements is to be determined in the next step. If the length you need for your bias tape is too long and you don't have enough fabric in one piece, you can cut 2 strips and join them with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, sewing them right sides together. For a cleaner finish, place the seam line at the center back neckline where it's less visible and visually balanced. Press the seam open before continuing to sew the tape. This will help the joint area lay flat and blend in smoothly with the rest of the binding. How long your bias tape should be? The first example is this sleeveless armhole, which uses a closed loop bias tape finish. The length that needs to be bias bound isn't very long. Now, I know these example garments already have bias tape applied, but imagine this step is done on your unfinished edge. Take your measuring tape and carefully measure along the entire edge that needs bias tape, dividing into small sections. For this sleeveless armhole, I'm using the side seam and shoulder seam to divide the armhole into 2 sections, front armhole and back armhole. Put your measurements into a diagram like this. Step 3. Measure and mark your bias tape. Grab the bias tape you just cut and your ruler. We'll use those section markings we made on the first step. For closed loops, add about 1 centimeter of seam allowance at the beginning of your bias tape strip. Mark this starting point. Now gently stretch it just slightly as you measure out the length of the first section of your garment edge. Mark this point on the bias tape. You can mark it with a pin or a fabric pen. This slight stretch is key. It makes the bias tape slightly shorter than the garment edge. Don't overstretch. Just add a tiny bit of tension. Continue measuring and marking the bias tape for each corresponding section of your garment edge. At the very end, add another 1 centimeter seam allowance after your final measurement mark. Step 4. Sew the bias tape. A. Align each section of the bias tape with the garment. Use pins to align each section of the bias tape with the matching section on the garment. Don't skip this step, especially if you're a beginner. My seamstress sews freehand with years of experience, but for beginners, skipping pins can lead to uneven results. For closed loops, take your bias tape strip, start at the side seam right at the underarm point, and fold in the 1 cm seam allowance at the start. Place the right side of the tape against the right side of the garment. Begin stitching 1 cm, 3/8 inch. As you sew, gently pull the bias tape, making sure the marks on the tape align exactly with the marks on the garment edge at each section. Keep a consistent, gentle pulling tension. When you reach the end, the second seam allowance overlaps the first, creating one seamless loop. B. Finishing the bias tape, understitch, fold, and edge stitch. You've attached the tape. Now trim the seam allowance down to about 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 inch. Along curved areas, make small snips into the seam allowance, stopping just before the stitch line. This helps the fabric spread or compress when turned, allowing the curve to lie flat. Understitching. This step really helps the bias tape roll neatly to the inside and stay hidden. Press the bias tape and seam allowance away from the garment. From the right side of the bias tape, stitch close to the seam line about 1 to 2 millimeters, 1/16 inch away, catching the seam allowances underneath. This stitching won't show on the outside of the finished garment. Now, fold the bias tape twice. Each fold is usually about 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 inch wide. Then, from the wrong side of the garment, edge stitch close to the inner folded edge of the bias tape. Keep your stitching line neat and even. See final press. At the end, use a tailor's ham or seam roll to press the bias tape area. These tools help maintain the curve without flattening the shape of your garment. And there you have it, a beautifully finished edge using bias tape. The second example is this V neckline, which uses an open loop bias tape finish, meaning it's open at both ends. The length that needs to be bias bound here is quite long. For a longer edge like a V neckline, uneven application here can really show. We'll divide this into smaller, manageable sections. Since the V neckline has open edges, imagine I'm doing this step before attaching the skirt to the bodice. To divide the V neckline, start at one open edge, then measure to the middle of the front neckline. You can mark it with a pin or a fabric pen, then to the shoulder seams, and finally to the center back, which you can find by folding the back bodice in half. Make sure the shoulder seams align. You can mark it with a pin or a fabric pen. To find the middle of the front neckline on the other side, just align the two sides of the front bodice together, match the open ends at the bottom, and find the exact corresponding spot on the other side. After you are done, you will have something like this, a neckline divided into 6 sections. Measure each section and write down the measurements. You only need to measure 1/2 of the garment, since the other side is exactly the same. Then, transfer all the measurements into a diagram like this. Measure and mark your bias tape. Grab the bias tape you just cut and your ruler. We'll use those section markings we made on the first step. Follow the tutorial in example 1 to learn how to measure and mark your bias tape. For open edges, you don't need to add seam allowances at the start and end of the bias tape itself. Simply measure and mark the sections on your bias tape, applying that same gentle stretch technique as you did for the closed loop. At each section marking, make a small snip or mark with a fabric pen on the bias tape, applying that same slight, consistent stretch for each measurement. Sew the bias tape. A. Align each section of the bias tape with the garment. Use pins to align each section of the bias tape with the matching section on the garment. Make sure the raw edge that needs to be bias bound is fully aligned. Don't skip this step, especially if you're a beginner. My seamstress sews freehand with years of experience, but for beginners, skipping pins can lead to uneven results. B. Finishing the bias tape, understitch, fold, and edge stitch. For open loops, the steps are the same, except there's no need to worry about seam allowance. Just sew normally without folding or adding extra length at the ends. Here's the most important part. As you sew, gently pull the bias tape. At the same time, keep the garment's raw edge neutral. Do not stretch the garment fabric. In fact, you may want to gently push the garment fabric toward the needle as you sew. This helps prevent stretching, especially around curved edges. See final press. At the end, use a tailor's ham or seam roll to press the bias tape area. These tools help maintain the curve without flattening the shape of your garment. When pressing bias tape, use steam and press gently. Don't stretch or distort the bias. To prevent the curved area from stretching out too much, my professional seamstress gently pushes the curve inward, bringing the fabric closer together. Then she presses with steam to help the fabric shrink slightly and return to shape. After steaming, she immediately sets the shape by pressing a tailor's clapper on top of the seam. This helps lock in the press, flatten the bias tape, and give it a crisp, professional finish. The next example is a boat neckline with a low-cut back. This one uses a closed-loop bias tape finish, similar to the sleeveless armhole we saw earlier. However, the bias-bound length is much wider and needs to be divided into more sections to make sure the bias tape lies flat. The sectioning technique is similar to what we did with the V neckline. I'm going to find the center front and then divide the low-cut back bodice into 4 sections. Each half of the back neckline is folded to find its midpoint. Take the measurements you just made and place them onto a diagram like this. Measure and mark your bias tape. We'll use those section markings we made on the first step. This boat neck and low-cut back form a closed loop, which is why we need to add a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance at both ends of the bias tape. Follow the steps in example 1 to measure and mark your bias tape accurately. Make sure to include those seam allowances when transferring the measurements onto your fabric strip. Sew the bias tape. Align each section of the bias tape with the garment. Use pins to align each section of the bias tape with the matching section on the garment. Don't skip this step, especially if you're a beginner. Watch the sewing tutorials in examples 1 and 2 for a full walkthrough on how to apply bias tape to this boat neck and low-cut back design. I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments if there are other techniques you'd like to see. I'm building a playlist full of fail-proof sewing tutorials like this one, all taught by my professional seamstress with over 2 decades of experience. Subscribe if you're interested in learning more. Don't forget to check out the patterns for these garments in my Etsy store, and follow me on Linen Girl for even more sewing tips. Thanks so much for watching. Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next video.